Let's talk about what the definition of consciousness is, and sentience and mind. So those are consciousness, sentience, and mind. Yosha, why don't you start with your definitions of them, then we'll hear John's, because obviously we have to
So,
agree on the definitions.
yeah, sure. The definitions, I don't think that are necessarily contentious points. We just need to anchor them somehow so we agree on what things we are talking about and what we're not talking about, I think. So to me, mind is basically the vehicle in which everything plays out. It's basically the mechanism and substrate that is emergent over mostly the activity of the brain, I think. And inside of the mind, there happens a model of the world and the self, and the mind also facilitates motivation at some level. And then the next term that we wanted to talk about is sentience. Sentience is the ability of a system to relate to its environment and to discover itself in the environment and establish this kind of relationship, and in this way learn what it's doing. And I don't think that sentience is the same thing as consciousness, because, for instance, it doesn't have to happen in real time. There doesn't need to be an immediate reflexive awareness of this process itself that is becoming aware. And in the sense, I think, for instance, that corporations are usually not conscious, I think, but many corporations are sentient in the sense that they understand what a corporation is, how this corporation relates to the world, and how it interacts with the world and plans for it. And of course, the sentience of the corporation is facilitated by the people that work for the corporation in this planning role. But so sentience is a functional properties that many intelligent systems develop. And consciousness is colloquially speaking, the feeling of what it's like. It's has a particular phenomenology that is, it looks like something to the system that is conscious. And I think that functionally consciousness is largely a control model of the attention of the system. And when we say that a system is conscious, for instance, a cat or a human being, what we mean is that this system is able to act on a model of its own awareness, which means it knows that it is aware of things and uses that to drive its own behavior in the moment.
Is that distinct from self-consciousness, that it's aware that it's aware?
Self is slightly different because you can be conscious without having a self. For instance, in dreams, you will very often notice that you are conscious, but there is no I. And also in meditative states, you don't need to focus on the I. What typically happens, though, in the type of consciousness that we have is that we know that something is conscious. So we are aware of the awareness, but that doesn't need to have a first-person perspective in consciousness. So I would say that first-person perspective and consciousness, even though in our normal daytime wakeful state are largely related, are actually orthogonal. You can have them independently of each other in a way.
Okay, John, so what are your definitions? Or what do you agree with, disagree with?
Well, first of all, about the referent before the sense. Yeah, I take it to my mind to refer to, although whether or not it forms a unified entity is perhaps part of the question. But when we're referring to mind, referring to some unity, some system by which we are intelligent and conscious. And I take intelligence to be the capacity to be a general problem solver. And I'm not sure what the problem I have with this in cognitive science is the term mind is equivocal. People use it in different ways, make different identity claims. The neuroscientist perhaps saying it's brain function. The AI person may say it's a particular kind of learning algorithm. The psychologist will say it's, that which generates behavior. And the point about this is it's not just a terminological difference. They use different methods of gathering evidence. They make different kinds of arguments. They have different kinds of theoretical entities. The psychologist may talk about working memory, right? The AI person may talk about certain aspects of machine learning. And of course, the neuroscientist may talk about various neural networks in the biological sense. So I take it that what I'm trying to do as a cognitive scientist is find out if all of those different definitions of mind can work together to get back to the coherent unity that we traditionally meant by the word mind. So that's part of the problem, but it's part of the fun of trying to do cognitive scientists. It's often very hard to get the anthropologist, the linguist, the psychologist, the neuroscientist and the AI person to all agree, and you put them in the room. And then usually you throw in philosophers who are supposed to help get all that discourse running smoothly, and they often make things more challenging, which is makes it especially fun. So I largely agree with what Yosha said, although I want to problematize it. And specifically, it's something that cognitive science is asking the question, what is mind, is not a clear question anymore. And I think getting clear about what that question is one of the tasks of cognitive science. So, sentience, and awareness, and I tend to bind sentience to Mason's notion of sentience, uh, which is aware. I think it might overlap with what Yosha means by awareness, but a sentient system is one that can, in some sense, size up its situation. It's aware of it, but not in just sort of the nebulous sense. Right? It can foreground and background information, things like that. So perhaps I think a little bit of a tighter connection between sentience and perceptual awareness. Consciousness. Consciousness is usually sort of two aspects. And of course, there's all of this. Everything I'm saying here is fraught, and Yosha knows this, right? People talk about two aspects of consciousness. There's one aspect that's often called access consciousness. This is part of what consciousness means is I can ready things. I can make things ready for reason. I can make them ready for problem solving. And I can bring aspects of my skills and my perception and my understanding together. And then there's what's called the phenomenal. Some people say phenomenological. There's a bit of confusion around that. But anyways, as Yosha said, this is the feeling of what it's like to be me here now in this situation. It can mean that. It can mean something very primitive, like what is it like to experience green? And this is the so-called problem of qualia. And so one way people think of consciousness is the place where qualia exists. For me, there's two central questions we are asking. And part of what I would argue is we need to integrate them together. And one of the strengths I see of Yosha's work is I do see him attempting, and I don't mean attempting as an insult. We're all attempting here, attempting to integrate these two questions together. One is the function question, which is basically what the hell does consciousness do? Given that so much of our intelligent behavior happens unconsciously, what is consciousness for? Some people are willing to say it's not for anything. It's just an epiphenomenon. It doesn't do anything. It has no function. Yosha doesn't say that. I'm not saying he does. The other question is the nature problem. How is it that something like consciousness exists in this physical world, which amongst all these objects that don't seem to have any of these subjective properties, qualia, things like that? At least since the scientific revolution, we separated all of those out from the physical universe, and we put them in this place. Now, I happen to think that you should try and answer those questions together in an integrated fashion. One of the criticisms I have of some of the central theories is they tend to answer one question while neglecting the other, and vice versa. So I think that's I had to say a little bit more because he went first, so I had to sort of take into what Yosha said. But that's trying to answer. Any good definition of consciousness should try and answer the function and the nature questions in an integrated fashion.
John, you said that some people say that consciousness is where qualia exist. What do you mean?
So one way, I mean, this goes back largely to Descartes, and it's picked up by Locke. Galileo made a distinction between primary qualities, right, or qualia, and secondary. Primary qualities are ones that are mathematically measurable in some sense, like, the length of an object, its mass, things like that. And Galileo proposed that those were real. They were in the objective world. And then there are all the qualia that are not mathematically measurable, like the experience, not the reflectance pattern, but the experience of greenness, the experience of sweetness, the experience of beauty, perhaps. And so for Descartes, following up on Galileo, those things did not exist in the world. They existed only in the mind. They were therefore only in the subject. They were subjective. And that's qualia. Now, the idea is there's lots of your there's lots of stuff happening in the mind unconsciously that doesn't seem to be generating any of that qualitative experience. It only seems to be the case, or it seems to be the case that, not only seems to be, it seems to be the case that those qualia only exist when I'm awake, alert, and aware in some fashion. And so they seem to be in consciousness. Now, that in is at best metaphorical, but that's how many people take that to be the central phenomena of consciousness, and that the problem of consciousness is largely the problem of answering that. Other people think other aspects of consciousness are central, like intentionality. That consciousness seems to be about things, directed at things.
If you enjoyed this toe clipping, then the full video is linked in the description. You should also sign up for Toe Mail, which is again in the description and the pinned comment. You'll receive immediate access to all exclusive updates from the Theories of Everything podcast. It also helps me communicate directly with the core toe community. You'll also receive my top 10 toes. Think of it as the intellectual version of Quentin Tarantino's Obsession.